A man who lived over 2,500 years ago asked a question that would haunt philosophy forever. How do you know what you think you know? Xenophanes of Colophon didn't just ask it. He answered it in a way that made everyone uncomfortable, especially the people who thought they had all the answers. Here's what makes his story strange. We know almost nothing about his personal life. No detailed biography survives, no letters, no diary entries. What we have are fragments, 45 pieces of poetry scattered across centuries, quoted by other writers, preserved by accident more than design. And from these fragments, we're supposed to reconstruct not just a life, but a revolution in human thought. The revolution started in a place that doesn't exist anymore. Colophon was a Greek city on the coast of what's now Turkey, part of a region called Ionia. This wasn't mainland Greece, this was the frontier where Greek culture met the massive Persian Empire, where ideas from Egypt and Babylon mixed with Greek traditions, where people asked questions that would have seemed strange or dangerous in Athens. Xenophanes was born there sometime around 570 BC, give or take a decade. The ancient sources can't even agree on his father's name. Was it Dexius? Dexinus? Orthomenes? Nobody knows for certain. What we do know is that he came from a world about to be destroyed. Imagine growing up in a prosperous trading city, learning poetry and music, absorbing the stories everyone told about gods and heroes. Homer's epics were everywhere, recited at festivals, taught to children, treated as something close to scripture. The gods in these stories were powerful and petty, sleeping with mortals, fighting among themselves, getting jealous and vengeful over the smallest slights. Everyone accepted this. Everyone except, eventually, one young poet who would spend his life pointing out how absurd it all was. But first came the catastrophe. When Xenophanes was about 25 years old, everything changed. The Persians were expanding westward, swallowing territory, crushing resistance. A general named Harpagus the Mede arrived at Colophon in 546 BC with an army. We don't know the details of what happened. We just know that Xenophanes left. Whether he fled before the conquest, was exiled after it, or simply chose to leave a city under foreign occupation, the result was the same. At 25, he became a wanderer. He would remain one for the rest of his extraordinarily long life. 67 years. That's how long he spent travelling, according to his own account. Think about that timeline. He left home at 25 and wandered until he was 92. Some sources say he lived even longer. If that's accurate, and if the dates are even roughly correct, this man witnessed nearly a century of Greek history from the unique vantage point of someone who belonged nowhere. How did he survive? Poetry. Specifically, a particular kind of performance poetry. The ancient Greeks had professional reciters called rhapsodes who would travel from city to city, performing at festivals, symposia, and public gatherings. Most rhapsodes performed Homer or Hesiod, the established classics. Xenophanes did something different. He performed his own compositions, his own critiques, his own revolutionary ideas wrapped in verse. Picture him at a symposium, one of those aristocratic drinking parties where wealthy Greek men reclined on couches, ate elaborate meals, drank wine mixed with water, and listened to entertainment. The expectation was praise, celebration, reinforcement of shared values. Athletic victories were glorified, military conquests were honoured, the gods were invoked with reverence. Then Xenophanes would start reciting, and everything would get uncomfortable. He attacked athletic culture directly. While everyone else was celebrating Olympic champions, he pointed out that physical strength didn't make cities wiser or more prosperous. A fast runner or a skilled wrestler brought no practical benefit to the community. Wisdom did. Knowledge did. Yet society rewarded the athlete and ignored the thinker. The critique wasn't subtle. It was designed to provoke, to make his wealthy audience question their assumptions. Then he went after the gods themselves, not just criticizing, but systematically dismantling the entire framework of Greek religion as it was commonly understood. Homer and Hesiod, the foundational poets of Greek culture, had attributed theft, adultery, and mutual deception to the gods. They made Zeus a serial adulterer. They made the gods petty and cruel and absurdly human in their motivations. Xenophanes asked a simple question: why would divine beings behave worse than decent humans? If gods are supposed to be perfect, why do our stories make them moral disasters? He pushed further. Here's the observation that made him dangerous. Humans create gods in their own image. The Ethiopians depict their gods as dark-skinned with broad noses. The Thracians imagine blue-eyed, red-haired deities. Every culture projects its own features onto the divine. Then came the devastating comparison. If horses could paint, they would paint horse-shaped gods. If oxen could sculpt, they would create ox-shaped deities. The implication was clear and radical. The Greek gods weren't revelations of cosmic truth. They were cultural projections, human psychology writ large and called sacred. This wasn't atheism exactly. Xenophanes proposed his own conception of deity. One God, greatest among gods and mortals, nothing like humans in body or thought. This God doesn't move around, doesn't intervene in petty human affairs, doesn't have emotions or desires. It simply exists, perceiving everything, thinking everywhere, setting all things in motion through pure thought. Some scholars call this monotheism, others say it's more like philosophical theism, a rational reconstruction of divinity stripped of mythology. Either way, it was revolutionary for the 6th century BC, and it made Xenophanes influential in ways he probably never intended. Plato would echo these critiques 2 centuries later. In the Republic, Socrates argues that poets should be banned from the ideal city, specifically because they tell immoral stories about gods. That's pure Xenophanes, filtered through Platonic philosophy. The influence runs deeper into Western thought than most people realize, but philosophy wasn't all he did. Xenophanes also turned his attention to the natural world, and here's where things get fascinating in a completely different way. He was walking around the Greek world, probably in Sicily or southern Italy, and he found fossils, shells and imprints of sea creatures embedded in rock, far from any ocean, high above sea level. Most people would have treated this as a curiosity, maybe woven some myth to explain it. Xenophanes drew a scientific conclusion. The sea once covered these areas. Water had been here, then receded. The Earth's surface wasn't static. It changed over enormous spans of time. He developed a theory from this observation. The fundamental principle of the universe, he suggested, was an endless cycle between wet and dry, between water and earth. These states alternated, and during the transitions, life would be destroyed and then regenerate. It's not modern geology, obviously, but the method is recognizably scientific. Observe physical evidence, draw conclusions, propose a natural mechanism rather than divine intervention. He applied the same approach to meteorological phenomena. The Greeks believed rainbows were manifestations of the goddess Iris. Xenophanes said no. A rainbow is just a particular kind of cloud, purple and red and green in appearance. Not a deity, not a message, just natural atmospheric conditions creating an optical effect. When sailors reported seeing strange glowing lights on their masts during storms, what we now call St. Elmo's fire, the common explanation involved divine intervention or supernatural forces. Xenophanes proposed that it was caused by the agitation of small cloud droplets. He was wrong about the mechanism. We'd later discover it's actually static electricity, but he was right about the principle. Natural causes, not supernatural ones. This is the pattern throughout his work. Strip away mythology, look at evidence, propose natural explanations. It's the foundation of scientific thinking, and it was happening in the 6th century BC, performed as poetry at drinking parties by a homeless wanderer. The poetry itself is mostly lost. We have 45 fragments, none longer than a few dozen lines. Some are single sentences quoted by later philosophers to make a point. The longest continuous passage we have is about 20 lines on proper behaviour at Symposia. Everything else is scattered, partial, filtered through the agendas of whoever quoted it. What we can piece together is a picture of someone who spent his life, as an outsider, using that position to critique everything. He criticised athletic culture, religious mythology, aristocratic excess, the glorification of wealth. He proposed radically different ways of thinking about divinity, nature, and knowledge itself. That last part, knowledge, might be his most important contribution, and it's the thing that made later philosophers both love and hate him. Fragment B34 is where it gets really interesting. Here's what survives. And of course the clear and certain truth no man has seen, nor will there be anyone who knows about the gods and what I say about all things. For even if, in the best case, one happened to speak just of what has been brought to pass, still he himself would not know. But opinion is allotted to all. Read that again slowly. Xenophanes is saying that certain truth about the gods and about the fundamental nature of reality is impossible for humans to achieve. Even if you happen to stumble onto a completely accurate statement about how things really are, you still wouldn't know you were right. You'd just have an opinion that happened to be correct. This is epistemology, the study of knowledge and its limits. And Xenophanes was doing it 25 centuries ago, in verse, while travelling between cities that would pay him to perform at parties. The ancient skeptics loved this fragment. They claimed Xenophanes as their founder, the first philosopher to recognise that certain knowledge is impossible. Later thinkers pushed back, arguing that Xenophanes wasn't a full skeptic, just a fallibilist, someone who acknowledged that we might be wrong even when we're right. The debate continues among scholars today. What exactly was Xenophanes arguing? Was he saying all knowledge is impossible, or just that we can never be absolutely certain? Was he advocating for giving up the search for truth, or for continuing the search while remaining humble about our limitations? We don't know, because we don't have enough of what he actually wrote. We have fragments quoted by people with their own agendas, trying to make their own points. Reconstructing Xenophanes is like trying to understand someone's personality by reading 45 of their tweets, selected and preserved by people who mostly disagreed with them. But here's what we can say with confidence. He lived an extraordinarily long life as an itinerant poet. He witnessed the Persian conquest and the transformation of the Greek world. He challenged the fundamental assumptions of his culture, and he did it all through poetry that was meant to be performed, heard, debated. He travelled throughout Sicily and southern Italy. Ancient sources mention him in Zancle and Catana, Greek colonies in Sicily, and associate him with Elea, a city in southern Italy that would later become famous as the home of the Eleatic school of philosophy. Some traditions even claim he founded that school, or taught Parmenides, who would become its most famous representative. Modern scholarship doubts these connections. The associations with Elea probably emerged later, when philosophers wanted to create a neat lineage connecting early thinkers. But whether or not he founded a school or had famous students, Xenophanes was part of a network of early Greek intellectuals who were asking revolutionary questions. He knew about Thales, the Milesian philosopher who claimed water was the fundamental substance of reality. He mentioned Pythagoras, though apparently to criticize him. Heraclitus, the philosopher of flux and change, knew Xenophanes' work well enough to attack it. Empedocles, who would later develop a sophisticated theory of four elements, was apparently a friend. These thinkers didn't form a school in any formal sense. They were scattered across the Greek world, from Ionia to southern Italy, pursuing different questions in different ways, but they were connected by a shared project, understanding the world through reason and observation rather than myth and tradition. Xenophanes stood out even in this company because of his dual focus. He wasn't just interested in natural philosophy, in explaining rainbows and fossils, and the fundamental nature of reality. He was equally concerned with theology, ethics, and what we'd now call social criticism. He used his poetry to challenge his culture's values, to question its gods, to push back against the glorification of athletics and wealth. It's this combination that makes him hard to categorize. Was he primarily a philosopher, a poet, a religious reformer, a social critic? The answer is all of these, and the categories themselves might be anachronistic. In the 6th century BC, these roles hadn't separated yet. Philosophy was still poetry. Religious thought was still part of natural inquiry. Social criticism was still performed at symposia. And through it all, for 67 years of wandering, Xenophanes kept asking uncomfortable questions. Why do we imagine gods who behave worse than humans? How do we know what we think we know? What should we value in a good society? Why do we celebrate athletes while ignoring wisdom? The personal details of his life remain frustratingly sparse. We know he had sons because ancient sources mention that he buried them with his own hands. We don't know how many, or when, or how they died. Later writers add that he was sold into slavery at some point, and later freed, but we have no context for this claim. It might be true, it might be legend. What we can reconstruct with more confidence is his intellectual legacy. The critique of anthropomorphic religion influenced Plato directly. The epistemological questions about knowledge and certainty shaped ancient philosophy through Aristotle and beyond. The naturalistic explanations for physical phenomena anticipated scientific method. The social criticism challenged Greek cultural values in ways that resonated for centuries. But there's something else, something harder to quantify. Xenophanes demonstrated that an outsider with nothing but words could challenge an entire culture's assumptions. He had no political power, no institutional backing, no wealthy patrons funding his work. He survived by performing poetry at parties, and yet his ideas proved powerful enough to influence philosophical traditions that lasted millennia. That's the part of his story that gets lost when we focus only on specific arguments or fragments. The man himself wandering from city to city for 67 years, supporting himself through performances, never settling, never finding a new home after losing Colophon. Always the outsider, always the critic, always asking questions that made comfortable people uncomfortable. The fragments we have show a sharp mind and a sharper tongue. When he criticized athletic culture, he didn't dance around the point. When he attacked anthropomorphic gods, he used devastating comparisons about horses and oxen. When he discussed knowledge, he pushed the question to its uncomfortable conclusion. We can't be certain even when we're right. This directness probably didn't make him popular with everyone. You don't spend 67 years traveling because you found a comfortable position somewhere. You travel because you have to, because you don't fit, because the questions you're asking aren't welcome in any one place for too long. And yet he kept performing, kept writing, kept pushing. The surviving fragments span topics from theology to geology, from ethics to meteorology, from epistemology to social criticism. Each one sharp, each one challenging, each one refusing to accept the comfortable answers. By the time Xenophanes reached old age, he'd witnessed transformations that would have seemed impossible in his youth. The Persian Empire had swallowed Ionia. Greek colonies in Italy and Sicily had grown into major centres of culture and commerce. The intellectual landscape was shifting, with philosophers and poets questioning traditions that had seemed eternal just decades before. And Xenophanes had been part of that shift, maybe even helped drive it, through nothing but words performed at symposia across the Greek world. His life stretched across nearly a century, from around 570 BC to sometime after 478 BC. That's not just remarkable longevity for the ancient world, it's a front row seat to one of the most transformative periods in human intellectual history. And unlike most people who simply experience historical change, Xenophanes actively shaped it. His questions would echo through philosophy for millennia. His critiques would influence religious thought in ways neither he nor his audience could have anticipated. But to understand why his ideas mattered so much, to see how a homeless poet became one of the foundations of Western philosophy, we need to look more closely at what he actually said and why it was so dangerous to say it. The fragments that survive tell us what Xenophanes thought. They don't always tell us why people cared enough to preserve his words for 25 centuries. Fragment B11 hits like a punch. Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods all sorts of things which are matters of reproach and censure among men: theft, adultery, and mutual deceit. In the 6th century BC, someone stood up at a symposium and announced that the foundational texts of Greek culture were morally bankrupt. Homer and Hesiod weren't just poets, they were scripture. The Iliad and the Odyssey, the Theogony, these weren't entertainment. They were how Greeks understood the cosmos, morality, their place in the world. And here's this wandering poet saying they got it fundamentally wrong. The gods in Homer do terrible things. Zeus rapes mortal women. Hera plots revenge. Ares delights in bloodshed. Aphrodite causes wars through her affairs. Hermes steals. The entire Trojan War starts because 3 goddesses can't resolve a beauty contest without dragging mortals into their vanity. Greeks knew this. They recited these stories at festivals, taught them to children, based their understanding of divine nature on them. But nobody questioned it. The gods were the gods. They operated by different rules. Their power placed them beyond human judgment. Xenophanes said no. If we condemn theft, adultery, and deceit in humans, we can't celebrate it in gods. Either morality means something or it doesn't. You can't have it both ways. This wasn't just theological critique, it was philosophical revolution. Xenophanes was applying logic to religion, demanding consistency, insisting that truth couldn't contradict itself. The method would echo through Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all the way to modern philosophy. But he didn't stop there. Fragment B14 goes further. Mortals suppose that the gods are born and have clothes and voices and shapes like their own. Fragment B15 delivers the knockout. But if oxen, horses and lions had hands or could paint with their hands, and fashion works as men do, horses would paint horse-like images of gods and oxen-like ones, and each would fashion bodies like their own. Think about what he's doing here. He's not just criticizing Greek religion, he's identifying the psychological mechanism behind all anthropomorphic religion. Humans create gods in their own image, because that's the only image they know. It's projection, pure and simple. Then he adds fragment B16. Ethiopians say their gods are flat-nosed and black. Thracians that theirs are blue-eyed and red-haired. Cultural relativism in the 6th century BC. Different peoples imagine different gods because they're each projecting their own features onto the divine. The argument is devastating because it's so obvious once stated. Of course, Ethiopians wouldn't imagine blonde gods. Of course, Thracians wouldn't imagine dark-skinned ones. Each culture creates deities that look like them. The implication is clear. All anthropomorphic gods are human inventions. Now imagine performing this at a symposium. You're surrounded by wealthy Greeks who've grown up with Homer, who've sacrificed to Zeus and Athena, who've organized their entire worldview around these divine figures. And you're telling them it's all projection, that their gods are as invented as the gods of Ethiopians or Thracians or anyone else. Some probably laughed. The clever ones would have appreciated the argument's elegance. But others, you don't attack a culture's foundational myths without making enemies. Here's where it gets interesting though. Xenophanes wasn't an atheist. He believed in God. Just not the Greek gods, not any anthropomorphic deity. Fragment B23. One God, among gods and men the greatest, not at all like mortals, in body or mind. Fragment B24. He sees all over, thinks all over, hears all over. Fragment B25. But without toil he sets all things in motion by the thought of his mind. Fragment B26. He remains always in the same place without moving. What Xenophanes describes is radically different from anything in Greek tradition. Not a pantheon of quarrelling deities, each with limited power and human flaws. One God, eternal, unchanging, all-perceiving, all-thinking, moving everything through pure thought alone. No body, no gender, no location, no movement, no birth, no death. This is closer to the god of later monotheistic traditions than to Zeus. Some scholars argue Xenophanes was the first monotheist in Western philosophy. Others say that's oversimplifying, that he might have believed in this supreme god alongside lesser divine beings. The fragments don't give us enough to be certain, but what's clear is that his god is utterly unlike the Olympians. And that's the point. If you start from logic rather than tradition, if you ask what a truly perfect being would be like, you don't end up with Zeus throwing lightning bolts and seducing mortals. You end up with something beyond human comprehension, operating through principles we can barely grasp. The practical effect of this theology was revolutionary. If God is perfect, unchanging, and uninvolved in petty human affairs, then natural events aren't divine interventions. Thunder isn't Zeus being angry. Rainbows aren't the goddess Iris. Storms at sea aren't Poseidon's revenge, which leads to Xenophanes' natural philosophy. Fragment B32. She whom men call Iris is in reality a cloud, purple, red and green to the sight. The rainbow isn't a goddess. It's a meteorological phenomenon involving clouds and light. This seems obvious now. In the 6th century BC, it was radical. Xenophanes was replacing mythological explanations with naturalistic ones. Looking for physical causes instead of divine will, he did the same with St. Elmo's fire, those strange glows that appear on ship masts during storms. Where sailors saw omens or divine manifestations, Xenophanes saw agitations of small droplets of clouds. His explanation was wrong in the details, but the approach was right. Look for natural causes, not supernatural ones. Most remarkably, he examined fossils, seashells found on mountaintops, marine fossils embedded in rock far from any ocean. The evidence troubled him because it didn't fit the world as he knew it. How did sea creatures end up on mountains? His conclusion: the sea had once covered everything. Earth's surface had been underwater. Over vast time it had dried, then would flood again in endless cycles. Human life would be extinguished in each flood, then regenerate in each dry period. This is geology. This is using physical evidence to reconstruct Earth's history. This is the scientific method in embryonic form. He was wrong about the cycles, but he was right about the principle. Look at what exists now. Use it to understand what happened before. The fragments don't tell us how Xenophanes connected these ideas. Did his theology lead to his natural philosophy? If God doesn't intervene in nature, you have to explain nature through natural causes. Or did his observations of nature lead to his theology? If you can explain rainbows and fossils without gods, maybe the gods themselves need rethinking. Probably both fed each other. But what matters is that Xenophanes was building a coherent worldview where logic, observation, and theology all aligned. The gods of Homer failed logical scrutiny. Nature revealed patterns that didn't require divine intervention. Therefore, if divinity exists, it must be radically different from what tradition taught. This is philosophy as we understand it. Not accepting inherited wisdom, but questioning everything, demanding consistency, following arguments where they lead regardless of tradition or comfort. But Xenophanes didn't just attack religion and explain nature. He also went after Greek culture's most sacred institution, athletics. The Olympic Games weren't just sports, they were religious festivals, demonstrations of excellence, celebrations of what humans could achieve. Winners became heroes, their cities honoured them with lifelong pensions, poets immortalised their victories. Athletic achievement was the pinnacle of Greek values. Xenophanes said this was backwards. Fragment B2 is a long one, describing athletic victors and their honours, then concluding, "Yet he would not be as worthy as I. Better than the strength of men or horses is my wisdom." Not subtle, He's directly claiming that his philosophical wisdom is more valuable than Olympic victory. In a culture that worshipped athletic achievement, that built temples to victorious athletes, this was heresy, but he explains why. Athletic victory doesn't make cities more just. It doesn't improve governance. It doesn't make people wiser or more virtuous. Its strength and speed impressive, but ultimately empty. What cities need is wisdom, understanding, the ability to think clearly about justice and governance and truth. This connects to his broader critique. Greek culture valued the wrong things. They honoured athletes more than philosophers. They based their theology on entertaining stories rather than logical consistency. They pursued wealth and excess rather than moderation and wisdom. They believed they understood the cosmos when they understood almost nothing. Fragment B34 makes this explicit. And of course the clear and certain truth no man has seen, nor will there be anyone who knows about the gods and what I say about all things. For even if in the best case one happened to speak just of what has been brought to pass, still he himself would not know. But opinion is allotted to all. This fragment became hugely influential in later philosophy. Later skeptics claimed Xenophanes as their founder based on this passage. They read it as denying the possibility of knowledge altogether, but that's probably misreading him. He's not saying we can know nothing. He's saying we can't have certain knowledge about things beyond our direct experience. We can't know for certain what the gods are like because we can't observe gods directly. We can have opinions, beliefs, theories. Some might even be true, but we can't have the kind of absolute certainty we often claim. This is epistemological humility, recognition of human cognitive limits. Even when you're right, even when your belief matches reality perfectly, you can't know with absolute certainty that you're right. There's always the possibility of error. This might seem like a minor point. It's not. It's the foundation of scientific thinking. Science doesn't claim absolute truth. It offers theories supported by evidence, always open to revision if better evidence appears. That approach starts here, with Xenophanes recognizing that certainty is impossible, but understanding is still worth pursuing. The fragments we have are scattered pieces of a larger whole. We know he wrote elegies about proper symposium conduct, criticizing drunkenness and excess. We know he wrote about the founding of Colophon and Elia. We know he engaged with other philosophers, mentioning Pythagoras and being mentioned by Heraclitus. What we don't know is how it all fit together in his mind. Did he see connections between his theology, his natural philosophy, his epistemology, his social criticism? Almost certainly, but the fragments don't give us the full picture. What they do give us is a voice, sharp, critical, uncompromising. A voice that questioned everything Greeks took for granted and did it through poetry performed at their own celebrations. That takes courage, or arrogance, probably both. The fragments survived because later philosophers found them useful. Plato engaged with Xenophanes' arguments about the gods. Aristotle discussed his natural philosophy. The skeptics claimed him as their founder. The Eleatics saw him as their precursor. Each tradition preserved the fragments relevant to their concerns, which means we're seeing Xenophanes through multiple filters. We have what later philosophers thought was worth preserving, quoted in contexts they chose, for purposes Xenophanes never intended. The full scope of his thought is lost, but what remains is enough to see why he mattered. The critique of anthropomorphism influenced every subsequent Greek discussion of divine nature. The naturalistic explanations set a precedent for scientific inquiry. The epistemological humility shaped how philosophers understood knowledge. The social criticism challenged Greek values in ways that resonated through Socrates and beyond. 45 fragments. That's what survived of a man who wrote thousands of lines across multiple works over 67 years. 45 fragments that influenced 25 centuries of Western thought. The question isn't why so few survived. The question is, what else did he say that we'll never know? The loss is staggering when you think about it. A man lives 92 years, writes thousands of lines across decades, influences everyone who comes after, and we're left with scraps, 45 fragments, some just a single line, others a few sentences. The longest barely reaches a paragraph. But here's what's strange. Those fragments survived because people kept quoting them, not out of reverence, not because they were preserving Xenophanes for posterity. They quoted him because they needed him for their own arguments. A later skeptic wants to prove knowledge is impossible. Quote Xenophanes on certainty. A theologian wants to attack anthropomorphism. Quote Xenophanes on gods. A natural philosopher wants precedent for empirical observation. Quote Xenophanes on fossils. Each tradition preserved what served their purposes, which means we're not reading Xenophanes. We're reading what later philosophers found useful in Xenophanes. The difference matters enormously. Take the skeptics. They loved fragment B34, the one about how, even if you speak truth, you can't know you're speaking truth. They made Xenophanes their founder, claimed him as the first skeptic, built entire philosophical schools on interpreting that passage as denying knowledge altogether. But read the fragment again. He's not saying knowledge is impossible. He's saying certainty about things beyond experience is impossible. That's different. Radically different. One position says we can know nothing. The other says we can know many things, just not with absolute certainty about ultimate matters. The skeptics needed an ancient authority to legitimize their position. So they read Xenophanes as more radical than he probably was, and their reading became the standard interpretation for centuries. Only recently have scholars started questioning whether that's what Xenophanes actually meant. This happens with all the fragments. Later philosophers shaped how we understand them by choosing what to preserve and how to interpret it. We're always reading Xenophanes through someone else's lens. Plato's lens, Aristotle's lens, the skeptic's lens, the eleatic's lens. Peel those lenses away, and what's left? Harder to say than you'd think. What we can say is this: the fragments reveal a mind that questioned everything. Religious tradition, questioned. Social values, questioned. Claims to knowledge, questioned. Even the physical world's nature, questioned through observation rather than accepted through myth. Fragment B11 attacks Homer and Hesiod for attributing theft, adultery, and mutual deceit to the gods. This wasn't literary criticism. This was theological revolution. Homer and Hesiod were scripture in ancient Greece. Children memorized their verses. Adults quoted them as moral authorities. The entire Greek understanding of divine nature came from these poets, and Xenophanes said they were wrong, completely wrong. The gods they described were moral disasters, worse than humans. Zeus commits adultery constantly. The gods lie, cheat, steal from each other. They're petty, vindictive, jealous. They behave worse than the humans who worship them. How can these be gods? How can beings less moral than humans deserve worship? The question sounds obvious now. In the 6th century BC, it was revolutionary. Nobody questioned Homer. Nobody suggested the traditional gods might be moral failures. Xenophanes did, in public, at symposia where people gathered to celebrate. He stood up and recited verses mocking the foundation of Greek religion. That takes either extraordinary courage or extraordinary arrogance, possibly both. Fragment B15 goes further. If cattle and horses had hands and could paint, they'd paint gods that looked like cattle and horses. Each species creates gods in its own image. Ethiopians imagine black gods. Thracians imagine red-haired gods. Everyone projects their own characteristics onto the divine. This is anthropology, psychology, cultural relativism. In the 6th century BC, Xenophanes recognized that religious belief reflects human psychology more than divine reality. We don't discover what gods are like. We invent gods that look like us, think like us, value what we value. The insight cuts deeper than ancient Greek religion. It challenges all anthropomorphic theology. Any time we describe God using human characteristics, human emotions, human reasoning, we're doing what Xenophanes criticized. We're making God in our image instead of trying to understand the divine on its own terms. His positive theology emerges from this critique. Fragment B23 describes one God, greatest among gods and men, not at all like mortals in body or mind. Fragment B24 adds that this God sees all over, thinks all over, hears all over. Fragment B25 says the God remains always in the same place, without moving, and sets all things in motion by the thought of his mind. This is abstract monotheism, or something close to it. One God, utterly unlike humans, unchanging, unmoving, controlling everything through pure thought. No anthropomorphism, no human characteristics projected onto the divine. Just mind, consciousness, power beyond human comprehension. Scholars argue about whether Xenophanes was actually monotheistic. The phrase one God greatest among gods and men could mean one supreme God among many lesser gods, or it could be a rhetorical flourish, acknowledging traditional language while actually describing something closer to monotheism. We don't know. The fragments don't settle it. But what's clear is that Xenophanes moved Greek theology toward abstraction, toward a divine nature completely separate from human nature. This influenced Plato's conception of the forms. It influenced Aristotle's unmoved mover. It shaped how later philosophers and theologians thought about transcendence. Then there's the natural philosophy. Fragment B28 discusses the boundary between earth and air. Fragment B29 describes earth and water as the source of all things. Fragment B30 mentions the sea as the source of water, winds, and clouds. Fragment B32 identifies the rainbow as a cloud, purple and red and green to the sight. These fragments show Xenophanes thinking about the physical world in naturalistic terms, not invoking gods to explain phenomena, not accepting mythological explanations, looking for natural causes based on observation. The rainbow example is perfect. Greeks called it Iris, named after the messenger goddess who travelled between Earth and Olympus. The rainbow was literally a deity in traditional belief. Xenophanes said, no, it's a cloud, a natural phenomenon, coloured water vapour, nothing divine about it. This move from mythological to natural explanation is fundamental to science. You can't study nature scientifically if you attribute everything to divine action. You need to assume natural causes operate according to consistent principles that can be understood through observation. Xenophanes made that assumption. Fragment B27 mentions fossils of sea creatures found on land, leading him to conclude that Earth was once covered by water. This is empirical reasoning, evidence-based conclusion, observation leading to theory about Earth's past. He got some details wrong. His cosmology was primitive by modern standards, but the method was sound. Look at evidence, form hypotheses, draw conclusions. Don't just accept traditional stories. The fragments on knowledge tie this together. If we can't have certain knowledge about gods because they're beyond our experience, we need different approaches to different types of questions. Things we can observe directly, we can know with reasonable confidence. Things beyond observation remain uncertain, no matter how much we believe our theories. This epistemological modesty shaped how later philosophers approached knowledge. Plato distinguished between knowledge and belief. Aristotle developed logic, partly to clarify what counts as demonstration. The entire Greek philosophical tradition grappled with questions Xenophanes raised about the limits and possibilities of human understanding. But we're still reading fragments, pieces, quotations torn from context. We don't have Xenophanes' full arguments. We don't know how he structured his thoughts, how he moved from one topic to another, how he connected his theology to his natural philosophy to his social criticism. The fragments on Symposia conduct add another dimension. Fragment B1 is longest surviving piece, describing proper behaviour at drinking parties. The floor should be clean, hands washed, cups ready. Garlands should be prepared, incense burning. Pure water, wine and bread should be available. The god should be honoured first with pious stories and pure words. Then drinking in moderation, enough to reach home without a servant's help unless you're very old. This sounds like etiquette advice, but it's more. It's about order, propriety, respect, about honouring divine powers correctly rather than through drunken excess, about maintaining dignity and self-control even during celebration. Other fragments criticise the athletic victories. Greek culture glorified athletes. Olympic victors received enormous honours, wealth, social status. Entire cities celebrated their champions. Poets wrote odes praising their achievements. Xenophanes said this was wrong. Fragment B2 argues that wisdom is more valuable than physical strength. Athletic victories don't make cities better governed. They don't improve laws or increase prosperity. Honouring athletes above wise men reveals misplaced priorities. Again, he's questioning fundamental Greek values. Athletic competition was central to Greek identity. The Olympic Games unified Greek culture across political divisions. Criticising athletic glory was criticising Greek civilization itself. Why did he do this? Why attack so many aspects of Greek culture simultaneously? Religion, social values, epistemological assumptions, traditional authorities? One possibility is that his exile shaped his perspective. Forced to leave Colophon at 25, wandering for 67 years, never having a stable home, always an outsider. That experience would make anyone critical of the societies they passed through. You see things differently when you don't belong, when you're always observing from the margins. Another possibility is that the connections were real in his mind. Bad theology leads to bad values. If you worship gods who act immorally, you'll accept immoral behaviour in humans. If you glorify physical prowess over wisdom, you'll make foolish political decisions. If you claim certainty about things you can't know, you'll stop questioning and investigating. The critiques connect. They form a system, even if we can only glimpse pieces of it through the fragments. A system that says, question tradition, observe nature, recognize your limits, value wisdom over glory, imagine divine nature as radically different from human nature. That system influenced everyone who came after, not always in ways Xenophanes would have approved. The skeptics took his epistemological caution too far. The Eleatics built metaphysical systems he might not have recognized. Later, theologians used his arguments for purposes he never intended. But influence doesn't require agreement. Xenophanes planted ideas that grew in unexpected directions. His questions became permanent parts of philosophical discourse. His critiques forced later thinkers to defend or modify positions he attacked. The fragments survived because they were useful. They gave later philosophers ammunition for their own battles. A convenient quotation, an ancient authority, a precedent for positions they wanted to defend. This means we'll never recover Xenophanes himself. The man behind the fragments is lost. We have his words filtered through centuries of interpretation, preserved for purposes he never intended, read by audiences he never imagined. What we have is enough to see why he mattered, not because he founded schools or developed complete systems, because he asked questions that couldn't be ignored, questions about knowledge, divinity, nature, values, questions that every subsequent philosopher had to address somehow. 45 fragments, a fraction of what he wrote. But those fragments changed how people thought about fundamental issues. They marked a transition from mythological to rational explanation, from uncritical acceptance to systematic questioning, from tradition-based to evidence-based thinking. The specific answers Xenophanes proposed mostly didn't survive. His cosmology was replaced. His theology was modified. His epistemology was refined and developed by others. But the questions persisted. The critical approach persisted. The willingness to challenge authority and tradition persisted. That's the real legacy, not the fragments themselves, but what they represent. A moment when someone looked at everything their culture took for granted and asked, but is it true? How do we know? What's the evidence? Could we be wrong? Those questions never stop being relevant. And imagine being the person asking them for the first time, standing in a symposium in 6th century Greece, surrounded by wealthy men celebrating an athletic victory, drinking wine mixed with water in proper proportions, listening to someone recite Homer's verses about Zeus throwing thunderbolts and Athena appearing in disguise. Then this elderly wanderer stands up and performs his own poem, not praising the host's runner for winning the foot race, criticizing the entire gathering for valuing running over thinking. The audacity of that moment is difficult to grasp from our distance. We live in a culture that expects criticism, that values questioning authority. Xenophanes performed in a culture where Homer was scripture, where the Olympic victors were heroes, where the gods in human form were the foundation of civic religion. Challenging all of that simultaneously wasn't academic debate. It was social transgression, which raises the question of how he survived doing it. Why didn't he get run out of every city he visited? Why did wealthy symposium hosts keep inviting this critic to their parties? The answer might be in the format itself. Poetry, elegiac couplets, hexameter verse. These weren't philosophical treatises. They were performances, entertainment with an edge. A symposium needed variety, needed stimulation, needed something to argue about after the poet left. Xenophanes provided that. He was provocative enough to be interesting, skilled enough to be impressive, but ultimately he was one voice among many at a drinking party. The performance context explains something else about the fragments. They're not systematic philosophy. They're occasional pieces, composed for specific contexts, addressing immediate situations. The symposium poems criticizing athletics were performed at symposia celebrating athletics. The theological critiques might have been responses to other poets performing traditional hymns. The epistemological statements could have been challenges to people claiming certain knowledge about distant events or divine matters. This means we're trying to reconstruct a philosophical system from what were essentially social commentaries, like trying to understand someone's entire worldview from their tweets. The fragments give us glimpses, moments of clarity, but the connecting tissue is gone. We don't know what questions prompted which responses. We don't know which ideas Xenophanes considered central and which were passing observations. Take his physical theories. The fragments tell us he thought the earth extended infinitely downward, that the sea was the source of all water and all winds, that the sun was made of small fiery particles gathered together, that what appeared as St. Elmo's fire was actually little clouds ignited by motion. These sound like cosmological speculation, but they might have been responses to specific claims by other thinkers, corrections, alternatives. Not a complete system, but individual positions in ongoing debates. The fragment about Earth extending downward infinitely deserves attention. It's weird. Every other early Greek cosmology has some kind of foundation or limit. Thales said everything floated on water. Anaximenes said air supported the Earth. Anaximander had the Earth suspended in the center of the cosmos. Xenophanes says it goes down forever. Why? One possibility is that he was being deliberately paradoxical, challenging the very idea that you could know what supported the Earth. If you can't dig down forever, if you can't observe the foundations, why claim certainty about what's there? Maybe there are no foundations. Maybe it's just Earth all the way down. That interpretation connects to his epistemological skepticism. You don't know what you haven't observed. You can't observe the bottom of the earth. Therefore, you don't know what's at the bottom. Therefore, maybe there is no bottom. It's an argument from ignorance transformed into a cosmological claim. Not, we don't know the bottom, but there might not be a bottom to know. His explanation for fossils shows different reasoning. He observed shells and imprints of sea creatures in rocks far from the ocean, sometimes on mountaintops. This was evidence that demanded explanation. The traditional explanation would have been mythological. Perhaps Poseidon once lived there, or a great flood had covered the earth, sent by Zeus as punishment. Xenophanes looked at the same evidence and concluded something different. Water had once covered these areas, not as divine punishment, but as natural process. The earth went through cycles, wet and dry. The sea advanced and retreated. When it advanced far enough, all life would be destroyed. Then eventually it would retreat, and life would begin again. This is empirical reasoning, evidence leading to hypothesis, not claiming absolute certainty, but making an inference from observation. It's also remarkably close to correct. We know now that sea levels have changed dramatically over Earth's history, that marine fossils do indicate former oceans. Xenophanes was wrong about the mechanism and the cycles, but right about the basic principle that fossils indicated environmental change. The rainbow explanation shows his method applied to atmospheric phenomena. Traditional Greek belief said the rainbow was Iris, a goddess who served as messenger between gods and mortals. The rainbow appeared when she travelled between divine and human realms. Xenophanes said no, it's a cloud, purple, red and green to the sight. Not a being, not a message, just light interacting with water vapour in a particular way. He didn't know about light refraction or water droplets acting as prisms, but he knew it was natural, not supernatural. Street. Elmo's fire got similar treatment. Sailors saw glowing lights on mast tips during storms and believed they were divine signs. Xenophanes proposed it was small clouds being agitated and catching fire from motion. Wrong about the mechanism, modern physics would explain it as electrical discharge, but right about the approach. Look for natural causes before invoking gods. These explanations reveal a pattern. Xenophanes looked at phenomena that everyone interpreted as divine intervention and asked whether natural processes could account for them instead. Not because he denied the divine. His theology was quite robust, but because he thought divine nature was fundamentally different from what people imagined. The one God he described didn't throw thunderbolts, or appear as rainbows, or manifest as glowing lights on ships. That God thought the universe into motion and remained unchanged. Atmospheric and geological phenomena needed different explanations. This separation is crucial. Traditional Greek religion made no distinction between natural and supernatural causation. Everything was divine activity. Thunder was Zeus, earthquakes were Poseidon, disease was Apollo's arrows. Xenophanes drove a wedge into that unified worldview. Some things were divine, specifically the nature of God itself, but most phenomena were natural. The rainbow wasn't iris, it was light and cloud. The distinction between theology and physics started here, but his physics has another quality worth noting: humility about certainty. He didn't claim to know exactly how these processes worked. He proposed explanations, offered hypotheses, made inferences from evidence. This contrasts with some of his contemporaries who announced cosmic principles with absolute confidence. Anaximenes declared that air was the fundamental substance of everything. Heraclitus proclaimed that fire was the cosmic principle and that all things flowed like a river. Xenophanes made observations and drew limited conclusions. Water once covered this area. The rainbow is cloud-based. The earth might extend infinitely downward. That epistemic modesty connects to his most famous fragment, B34, the one about knowledge and opinion. It's worth looking at more carefully because it's been interpreted in wildly different ways over the centuries. The ancient skeptics loved it. They quoted it as proof that their founder had already understood the impossibility of certain knowledge. If even someone who happened to speak the complete truth couldn't know they had it, their knowledge was impossible. All we had was opinion, but modern scholars read it differently. The fragment doesn't say knowledge is impossible, it says certainty is impossible for humans regarding particular types of claims. Claims about the gods, claims about all things, claims about matters beyond human observation. You might be right, you might speak the complete truth, but you couldn't know you were right because you couldn't verify it directly. This is epistemological sophistication that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Xenophanes distinguished between truth and justified belief. You could believe something true without knowing it was true. Knowledge required not just truth, but some kind of justification, some way of confirming that your belief matched reality. For observable matters, you could potentially get that justification. For unobservable matters like divine nature or the Earth's foundations, you couldn't. The fragment creates a hierarchy of epistemic access. Some things are observable and therefore knowable with reasonable confidence. Some things are partially observable and therefore subject to reasonable inference. Some things are completely beyond observation and therefore beyond certain knowledge. We can have opinions about all three categories. We can only claim knowledge about the first. Apply this to his other fragments. His natural explanations for rainbows and fossils fall into the first two categories. Observable phenomena requiring explanation. His theology falls into the third. The nature of God is beyond human observation. Therefore, humans can have opinions about it, can reason about it, but can't claim certain knowledge. The irony is that Xenophanes himself made strong theological claims. One God, unlike humans in body and mind, thinking the universe into motion without moving. Wasn't he violating his own epistemic principles? Maybe not. Maybe he was offering those theological claims as reasoned opinion, not certain knowledge. As what makes sense given the problems with anthropomorphic theology. If gods shouldn't be imagined as immoral humans, what should they be imagined as? Something radically different. Unchanging, unified, non-anthropomorphic. This is inference, not observation. Opinion, not knowledge. But it's reasoned opinion. Better than unreasoned opinion. That interpretation makes Xenophanes remarkably consistent. He's not claiming to know the nature of God with certainty. He's arguing that the traditional conception is flawed and offering an alternative that avoids those flaws. The alternative itself remains opinion, the best he can do given human limitations. But it's better opinion than Homer's, more rationally defensible, less obviously contradictory. The social criticism fits here too. His attacks on luxury and athletic glory and drunkenness at symposia. These aren't claims about unobservable matters. They're value judgments about observable behaviour. He could see wealth being wasted on excess. He could see athletes being honoured above wise men. He could see symposia descending into intemperance. His criticism was based on observation and on reasoning about what values benefit a city versus what values harm it. Wisdom benefits cities more than athletic victory. Why? Because athletic victory brings temporary glory, while wisdom improves decision-making permanently. Because strong runners don't make laws more just or defense more effective. Because honouring physical prowess over intellectual achievement sends the wrong message about what matters. These are arguments subject to debate, but they're arguments from observable consequences, not claims about transcendent truths. The fragments paint a picture of someone thinking carefully about different types of claims and appropriate levels of confidence for each. Natural phenomena: observe, hypothesize, test against further observation. Social values: observe, consequences, reason, about effects, argue for better alternatives. Divine nature. Recognize the limits of human knowledge. Critique obviously flawed conceptions. Propose more rationally defensible alternatives while acknowledging uncertainty. This is methodology, a way of approaching different questions with different tools. Not a complete system, but a set of principles for investigation. Observe when you can. Reason carefully. Recognize your limits. Don't claim certainty beyond your evidence. Critique bad arguments. Propose better alternatives. That methodology influenced everyone who came after, even those who reached different conclusions. Parmenides, allegedly his student though that's disputed, took the epistemological questions in a radical direction. If sense experience is unreliable, if opinion dominates human understanding, then perhaps reason alone could reach truth. Pure logic, independent of observation. That's not where Xenophanes went, but the question of how to achieve reliable knowledge starts with him. Heraclitus, his contemporary and critic, emphasized change and flux where Xenophanes emphasized the unchanging divine. But both were responding to the same problem: how to understand reality beneath surface appearances. The atomists, Democritus and Leucippus, developed materialist explanations for natural phenomena that built on Xenophanes' project of finding natural rather than supernatural causes. The sophists took his epistemological skepticism and applied it to ethics and politics, arguing that since certain knowledge was impossible, persuasion and convention ruled human affairs. Socrates and Plato responded to both Xenophanes and the sophists, trying to find a middle ground between dogmatism and relativism, between claiming certain knowledge and abandoning truth entirely. Every major development in Greek philosophy for the next 2 centuries engaged with questions Xenophanes raised or positions he took, not because he had the right answers, because he asked the right questions and demonstrated that traditional answers were inadequate. That's influence, not founding a school or developing a complete system, changing the terrain, making certain questions unavoidable, showing that certain approaches were possible. The fragments survived because they were useful to later thinkers with their own agendas. The skeptics quoted him on knowledge and opinion. The theologians quoted him on divine nature. The natural philosophers quoted him on physical phenomena. Each group preserved the pieces relevant to their concerns. This means we've lost whatever didn't fit later categories: personal reflections, historical observations, literary criticism, anything that wasn't philosophically or theologically useful to later traditions. What we have is what served other people's purposes. That's frustrating but instructive. It shows which ideas had staying power, which questions remained relevant across centuries, which critiques continued to need addressing. The theological critique of anthropomorphism lasted because every monotheistic tradition eventually had to deal with similar issues. How do you talk about God without making God too human? The epistemological distinction between knowledge and opinion lasted because every philosophical tradition had to establish criteria for reliable belief. The natural explanations lasted because the project of scientific investigation continued. Xenophanes probably wouldn't recognize what his ideas became. The skeptics took his caution about certainty further than he intended. The Eleatics built metaphysical systems from fragments of his thought. The theologians used his monotheism for purposes he never imagined. But ideas don't belong to their originators. They belong to whoever finds them useful. They grow in directions their first formulators couldn't predict. That transformation happened because the ideas contained the seeds of their own development. When Xenophanes said certain knowledge was impossible, he created space for different responses. Some took that as license for relativism. Others saw it as a challenge to develop better methods. The same fragment could support opposing conclusions depending on what you emphasized. This is how intellectual traditions work. Someone poses a problem or offers a solution. Later thinkers accept part of it, reject other parts, extend some aspects in new directions. The original formulation becomes unrecognizable, but its DNA persists in the descendants. Xenophanes didn't create Greek philosophy single-handedly, but the questions he raised about knowledge, divinity, and natural explanation became permanent fixtures. Now, what about the man himself? We know almost nothing personal. The biographical details are sparse and often contradictory. Ancient sources say his father was named Dexius or Dexinus or Orthomenes. Take your pick. They can't even agree on that basic fact. He was born in Colophon, that much seems certain, a prosperous Ionian city on the coast of Asia Minor, known for its cavalry and its luxury. The kind of place that produced poets and thinkers, along with merchants and soldiers. He left at 25. That detail comes from his own poetry, one of the few autobiographical fragments that survived. By his own account, he wandered for 67 years, which would make him 92 when he composed that particular poem. Maybe older when he died. That's extraordinary longevity for the ancient world, where most people didn't reach 50. Why did he leave Colophon? The timing suggests Persian conquest. Around 546 BC, Harpagus the Mede conquered the Ionian cities. Xenophanes mentions the coming of the Mede in one fragment, which probably refers to this event. Whether he fled as a refugee or left shortly before the conquest, the displacement shaped everything that followed. Exile does things to a person's perspective. You see your homeland's customs from the outside. You encounter different ways of living, different gods, different values. The certainties that seemed natural when you lived in one place start looking arbitrary when you've seen how differently other people arrange their lives. That outsider's view probably contributed to Xenophanes' critical stance toward Greek religion. Hard to maintain that Zeus is obviously real and obviously Greek when you've spent decades moving between cultures that worship entirely different deities. He supported himself through poetry, not writing for wealthy patrons, though he probably had some, performing at symposia, those drinking parties where aristocrats gathered to celebrate victories or welcome young men into society. His fragments on proper symposium conduct suggest he was a regular at these events. He knew the culture, participated in it, but also critiqued it from within. The symposium poems are interesting because they reveal his values: moderation over excess, wisdom over athletic prowess, piety that meant respecting the divine properly, not the superstitious practices Homer described. These weren't abstract philosophical positions. They were practical advice for people living specific lives in specific social contexts. He criticized the Greek obsession with athletic victories. This was bold. Athletics were central to Greek identity. The Olympic Games, the Pythian Games, these weren't just entertainment. They were religious festivals, expressions of arete, excellence. Winning brought glory to your city, wealth to your family, fame that could last generations. And here's Xenophanes saying it's worthless compared to wisdom. Our skill is better than the strength of men and horses. This custom is quite irrational, nor is it right to prefer strength to this good skill of ours. For if there should be among the people a good boxer, or one who excels in wrestling or in the pentathlon, or one who wins in the race, which is most honoured of all human deeds of strength in athletic games, the city would not on that account be any better governed. That's fragment 2, one of the longer surviving pieces. It's a direct challenge to what his audience valued most. You're celebrating the wrong things. Physical prowess doesn't improve the city. Wisdom does. Intelligence, good judgment. These matter more than running fast or throwing far. You can imagine how that went over at a symposium celebrating some athlete's victory. Probably not well, but Xenophanes kept saying it, kept performing these poems, kept making the argument. Either he was remarkably courageous or remarkably thick-skinned, or both. Ancient biographers loved adding suffering to philosophers' lives, made them seem more serious, more committed to truth despite worldly hardship. what we can say with confidence, he wandered for decades, supporting himself through poetry, never settling permanently anywhere. He lived in Elia for a time, also in Zancli and Catana in Sicily. He probably spent time in other Greek cities too, performing, observing, composing new material based on what he saw. The itinerant life gave him material. Travelling exposed him to different geological formations, different weather patterns, different cultural practices. When he theorized about the Earth being made of earth and water in alternating cycles, he was drawing on observations from multiple locations. When he explained rainbows as clouds rather than divine messengers, he'd probably watched rainbows form in different climates. His explanation of fossils required observation. Finding seashells embedded in rock, far from any ocean, demands explanation. The traditional answer involved myths about floods or divine intervention. Xenophanes looked at the evidence and concluded water once covered areas that were now dry land. The earth went through cycles, wet became dry, dry became wet. Life perished and regenerated with these changes. This is geological thinking before geology existed as a discipline. He's proposing that the Earth's surface changes over time, that continents aren't static, that current conditions don't represent how things have always been, and he's basing this on physical evidence, not mythology or speculation. The same empirical approach appears in his explanation of St. Elmo's fire, that eerie glow that appears on ship masts during thunderstorms. Sailors considered it supernatural, a sign from the gods. Xenophanes proposed it was caused by agitated cloud droplets. He was wrong about the mechanism. We now know it's electrical, but the approach was right. Look for natural causes. Don't default to divine explanation. This methodology wasn't completely original. The Milesian philosophers, Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes, had already started explaining natural phenomena through natural principles. But they didn't explicitly critique religious explanations the way Xenophanes did. They offered alternative theories without directly attacking Homer and Hesiod. Xenophanes made the conflict explicit. The old stories are wrong. The gods aren't like Homer described. Natural phenomena have natural causes. You need to think critically about what you've been taught. That directness, that willingness to name the problem, that's what made him influential, despite not founding a school or developing a complete system. He also attacked specific contemporaries. We have a fragment where he mocks Pythagoras, that other famous Greek thinker who was approximately his contemporary. The story goes that Xenophanes saw someone beating a puppy and said to stop because he recognized the voice of a deceased friend in the puppy's yelps. This is satirizing Pythagoras' belief in reincarnation, the transmigration of souls between bodies. Whether the incident actually happened doesn't matter. Xenophanes was willing to ridicule beliefs he found absurd, even when held by famous and respected figures. Pythagoras had followers, a whole community devoted to his teachings about mathematics and mysticism and proper living. Xenophanes didn't care. If the belief was ridiculous, he'd say so. Heraclitus returned the favour. That other great pre-Socratic philosopher, famous for saying you can't step in the same river twice, criticised Xenophanes by name, called him one of those people who pursued learning without developing true wisdom. Heraclitus was contemptuous of most other thinkers, so this isn't surprising, but it shows Xenophanes was prominent enough to be worth attacking. These intellectual networks, these relationships of influence and critique and rivalry, they shaped how ideas developed. Xenophanes influenced Parmenides, supposedly, though that connection might be overstated by later sources, trying to create neat philosophical lineages. He definitely influenced the skeptics who came centuries later and claimed him as their founder. He influenced Plato's critiques of Homer in the Republic, but he probably didn't set out to influence anyone. He was performing poetry, making arguments, trying to get people to think differently about the gods and knowledge and what matters in life. The philosophical legacy came later, constructed by people categorizing and systematizing ideas that Xenophanes expressed more loosely. This raises questions about how we should interpret the fragments. Are they philosophical treatises, poetic performances, social criticism, religious reform? All of the above simultaneously. The genres weren't separated the way we separate them. Philosophy, poetry, theology, political thought. These blended together in ways that make modern categorization difficult. When Xenophanes says, "One God, greatest among gods and men," not at all like mortals in body or mind, is he doing theology or philosophy or poetry? The statement appears in verse form, so it's poetry formally. It makes a theological claim about divine nature. It uses rational argument to critique traditional beliefs. So it's philosophy. It's all three at once. This is why attempts to make him fit one category always fail. He's a poet, philosopher, theologian, social critic. Or maybe those weren't separate roles in his world. Maybe someone interested in truth pursued it through whatever means seemed appropriate. Verse, argument, observation, critique. The personal voice comes through in fragments, despite their brevity. There's personality there, someone who's opinionated, critical, unwilling to accept conventional wisdom just because everyone believes it. Someone who values wisdom over strength, truth over comfortable illusions, moderation over excess. The Symposium poems especially reveal someone embedded in elite culture while maintaining critical distance from it. He attended these parties, participated in the rituals, knew the customs, but he also stood apart, commenting on what he saw, suggesting different values. The insider-outsider simultaneously. That position, the exile who's travelled everywhere but belongs nowhere permanently, probably enabled his critical perspective. He could see what natives took for granted. He could compare practices across different cities and cultures. He wasn't committed to defending any particular tradition because none of them was fully his anymore. 67 years of wandering. Think about that. Most of his adult life spent moving between cities, performing for different audiences, observing different customs, developing theories based on accumulated experience, never settling, never joining a community permanently. Always the visitor, the guest, the performer, who arrives and leaves. What does that do to a person? Maybe it makes you skeptical about local certainties. Maybe it teaches you that people are convinced of contradictory things in different places, which suggests belief isn't reliable evidence of truth. Maybe it makes you lonely, disconnected, searching for something more permanent than human custom. His theology points toward that search, the one God, unchanging, always in the same place, moving all things by thought alone. This is the opposite of human experience, especially the experience of an itinerant poet. Humans move constantly. Humans change. Humans are embodied. The divine, as Xenophanes conceives it, transcends all that. Some scholars read this as philosophical monotheism, the first clear articulation of one supreme deity. Others argue he's still working within Greek polytheism, but ranking the gods with one supreme being above the rest. The fragments don't settle the question definitively. Both readings are possible. What's clear is that his conception of divinity is radically different from Homer's. No anthropomorphic God who cheats and lies and has affairs. No divine hierarchy based on family relationships and power struggles. Instead, an abstract principle, perfect and unchanging, unlike humans in fundamental ways. This connects to his epistemology. Humans can't know divine truth with certainty because humans are limited, embodied, bound by particular perspectives. The divine is unlimited, unbounded, beyond human comprehension. The gap between human and divine is unbridgeable through normal means. That's why opinion dominates human affairs. That's why even if someone happened to state the truth perfectly, they couldn't know they'd done so. The limitations aren't just practical, they're built into the structure of human existence versus divine reality. Xenophanes died sometime after composing the poem about his 67 years of wandering. Maybe at 92, maybe older. We don't know where, we don't know how. Ancient sources don't record his death the way they record Socrates' execution or Plato's peaceful passing in old age. He just disappears from the historical record. The man vanishes. The fragments remain, scattered through later texts, preserved by people with their own agendas. And from those fragments, we reconstruct a thinker who challenged the foundations of Greek religion, questioned the possibility of certain knowledge, sought natural explanations for physical phenomena, and lived as an exile criticizing the culture he could never fully leave behind. The influence outlasted the man by millennia. The questions he raised about knowledge and divinity and proper values didn't disappear when he did. They became part of the ongoing conversation, adapted and modified by later thinkers, but traceable back to those few surviving verses. Assistant. And here's the thing about survival through fragments. We get pieces, not the whole picture. Imagine trying to understand someone's entire worldview from 45 disconnected quotes. You'd miss the transitions, the qualifications, the full context. You'd probably misunderstand them in fundamental ways. That's our situation with Xenophanes. We have bits, provocative bits, important bits, but bits nonetheless. The coherent philosophy, if there was one, is lost. What remains are the moments later thinkers found useful enough to quote. This creates interpretive problems. Take fragment B34, the famous statement about knowledge and opinion. Different scholars read it completely differently. Some see radical skepticism. We can't know anything with certainty. Others see moderate fallibilism. We can have true beliefs but can't be absolutely certain they're true. Still others argue he's talking specifically about theology, not making a general epistemological claim. The text supports multiple readings because we lack the surrounding context. We don't know what came before or after. We don't know what question he was answering or what position he was arguing against. The fragment floats free, available for different interpretations. Same with the theological statements. One God, greatest among gods and men, could mean one supreme God above many lesser gods. Or it could mean one God period, with among gods and men just being conventional language. The Greek doesn't settle it definitively. These ambiguities frustrate modern scholars, but they're also productive. They force engagement with the text, careful reading, consideration of different possibilities. You can't just assume you know what Xenophanes meant. You have to argue for your interpretation, defend it against alternatives. The biographical uncertainty compounds the problem. If we knew more about his life, his influences, his intended audience, interpretation would be easier. But we don't. We have a name, a birthplace, a few scattered facts, and lots of later traditions that might or might not be reliable. Did he really teach Parmenides? Ancient sources say so, but modern scholars doubt it. The connection seems to be based on both being associated with Elia and both dealing with questions about knowledge and reality. That's weak evidence. Lots of thinkers dealt with those questions without being teacher and student. Was he really sold into slavery? Maybe. It would explain some things about his critical stance toward conventional values. Or maybe later biographers invented it to make his story more dramatic. We can't know. Did he actually bury his sons with his own hands? The detail is specific enough to be credible. Ancient writers didn't usually invent that kind of personal tragedy, but we can't verify it. It exists as a fragment of testimony, possibly true, possibly embellished. What we can verify is the poetry itself, or at least portions of it, the fragments that survive in quotation. Even there, we face problems. Later authors sometimes paraphrased rather than quoting exactly. Sometimes they quoted from memory and got words wrong. Sometimes scribes copying manuscripts introduced errors. Textual criticism tries to establish the most reliable version of each fragment, comparing different sources, analysing metre and vocabulary, making educated guesses about what Xenophanes actually wrote versus what later transmission changed. It's painstaking work that rarely produces certainty, but the core ideas come through despite textual and interpretive difficulties. The critique of anthropomorphism is clear even if we debate the exact formulation. The distinction between knowledge and opinion is present even if we argue about its precise meaning. The natural explanations for phenomena like rainbows and fossils survive, even if some details are uncertain. These ideas matter because they represent shifts in how Greeks thought about fundamental questions. Before Xenophanes, or at least before the pre-Socratics generally, Greeks accepted Homer and Hesiod as authorities on divine matters. The poets said the gods were like powerful humans, so that must be true. Xenophanes said no, think about it. If horses could draw, they'd draw horse gods. If oxen could sculpt, they'd sculpt ox gods. Humans make gods in their own image because that's all they can imagine. But that doesn't mean gods actually are like humans. In fact, it suggests they're probably not. This is reasoning, not revelation. He's using logic to challenge traditional beliefs. That approach, that willingness to question authority and think for yourself, that's foundational to Western philosophy. Not because Xenophanes invented it from nothing, but because he demonstrated it clearly and others followed. The same with epistemology. Before the pre-Socratics, knowledge was what the poets said, or what tradition handed down, or what seemed obvious. Xenophanes introduced doubt. How do you know that's true? What's your evidence? Even if you're right, how can you be certain? These questions force a different kind of rigor. You can't just assert things. You have to justify them. You have to consider alternatives. You have to distinguish between what you believe and what you can prove. Modern science operates on these principles. Hypothesis, evidence, skepticism about claims, willingness to revise beliefs when evidence changes. Xenophanes didn't invent the scientific method, but he contributed to the intellectual climate that eventually produced it. His natural explanations for physical phenomena pushed in that direction. Don't just accept that rainbows are goddesses. Look at them carefully. Consider what they're made of. Propose explanations based on observable properties of clouds and light. Test your explanations against further observations. That's not modern science yet. He didn't do controlled experiments. He didn't have the mathematical tools to model phenomena precisely. But the impulse is there. Seek natural causes for natural events. This impulse had consequences. If rainbows aren't goddesses, if lightning isn't Zeus's weapon, if earthquakes aren't Poseidon's anger, then natural disasters don't require divine explanations. They happen according to natural principles we can potentially understand. That strips the world of some enchantment but gains explanatory power. You can predict natural phenomena if you understand the principles. You can potentially control them. The gods become less relevant to daily life. This wasn't Xenophanes' explicit goal. He wasn't trying to secularize Greek society. He was a religious thinker proposing different conceptions of divinity. But the logic of natural explanation, once started, tends to expand. If this phenomenon has a natural cause, what about that one? And that one? Later Greek thinkers pursued this logic. The atomists proposed that everything, including life and consciousness, arose from atoms moving in void. No divine intervention required. The Hippocratic physicians explained disease through natural causes, not divine punishment. Natural philosophy gradually displaced mythological explanation across more and more domains. Xenophanes contributed to that process even though it went further than he probably intended. His god remained important, setting everything in motion through thought. But the day-to-day operations of nature followed natural principles. The social criticism matters too. His attacks on athletic culture, his advocacy for moderation at symposia, his critique of luxury and excess, these addressed real problems in Greek society. Cities did spend enormous resources on athletics. Symposia did feature excessive drinking and behaviour. The wealthy did flaunt their resources in ways that created social tension. Whether anyone actually changed their behaviour because of Xenophanes' poems is questionable, probably not much, but he articulated an alternative set of values: wisdom over strength, moderation over excess, piety that meant proper understanding of the divine rather than superstitious rituals. These values influenced later philosophers. Socrates' emphasis on wisdom and virtue over conventional success echoes Xenophanes. Plato's critique of democracy as rule by the ignorant rather than the wise draws on similar ideas. The Stoic emphasis on internal virtue rather than external goods has roots in this tradition. Again, Xenophanes didn't create these values alone. Other thinkers contributed, but his clear articulation in memorable verse helped transmit them across generations. The verse itself deserves attention. He wrote in traditional meters, elegiac couplets, and hexameters, the forms Homer used, but he used them for untraditional purposes. Satire, philosophical argument, social criticism. This was innovative. Greek poetry before Xenophanes was mostly narrative epic or lyric expressions of personal feeling. Using poetry for systematic critique of religion and society, that was new. It created a tradition of philosophical poetry that continued through Parmenides and Empedocles and later thinkers who expressed philosophical ideas in verse. Why verse rather than prose? Partly practical. Verse is easier to memorize and perform. In an oral culture, that matters. If you're traveling and performing your ideas, verse helps audiences remember them. The meter and rhythm create structure that aids memory, but verse also has aesthetic power. Ideas expressed beautifully are more persuasive. The form reinforces the content. When Xenophanes describes his one God in elegant hexameters, the poetry itself suggests divine order and beauty. Later philosophers mostly abandoned verse for prose. Prose allows more precision, more complex arguments, more flexibility, but something is lost. The aesthetic dimension, the memorable formulation, the pleasure of language itself. Xenophanes wrote at a transitional moment when verse was still the natural medium for serious thought, but prose was beginning to emerge. His work bridges that transition, demonstrating what verse could achieve while pointing toward what prose would later accomplish. The fragments that survive represent perhaps 1% of what he wrote. Ancient sources mention poems of 2,000 lines about Colophon and Eleia. Gone. They mention collections of satires in at least 5 books. Gone. We have 45 fragments, most just a few lines. Some just single words quoted to illustrate grammatical points. What was lost? Probably detailed arguments we'd find valuable. Probably responses to objections we'd like to see. Probably personal reflections that would illuminate his character. Probably contextual information that would resolve current interpretive disputes. But also, probably, material we wouldn't care about. Conventional verses praising hosts who fed him. Formulaic descriptions of landscapes. Technical discussions of meter and poetic composition. Not everything an ancient writer produced was brilliant. What survives is what later generations found worth preserving. The theological critiques survived because they were useful to later religious thinkers. The epistemological claims survived because they were useful to skeptics. The natural explanations survived because they were useful to philosophers of nature. This selection process means we have a distorted sample. The parts of Xenophanes that influenced subsequent thought survived. The parts that didn't influence anyone disappeared. We see him through the lens of his reception, not as he saw himself. That's true for all ancient figures whose works survive only in fragments. We reconstruct them from pieces selected by others for purposes different from the original intent. It's like trying to understand someone's personality from their most quoted remarks. You get something, but not the whole person. Still, what we have is enough to recognize significance. The critique of anthropomorphism influenced theology for 2 millennia. The epistemological caution about certain knowledge became foundational to philosophy. The natural explanations contributed to the development of science. The social criticism expressed values that continue to resonate. These aren't minor contributions. They're fundamental shifts in how people thought about religion, knowledge, nature, and society. One person didn't cause these shifts alone, but Xenophanes articulated them clearly enough to influence everyone who came after. And he did it while wandering from city to city, performing for his supper, living as an exile for 67 years. No university position, no wealthy patron funding his research, no students gathering to preserve his teachings. Just a poet with ideas, travelling and performing and thinking. The wandering itself might have been crucial. Staying in one place, you're embedded in one tradition. Moving constantly, you're exposed to variety. You see different customs, different beliefs, different ways of organising society. That comparison, that ability to step outside any single tradition, that enables the critical perspective. Xenophanes couldn't defend Colophon's gods as obviously true, because he'd seen Athenians worship different gods with equal conviction. He couldn't accept athletic values as natural, because he'd encountered societies with different priorities. The variety of human practice suggested that none of it was as necessary or certain as people believed. This cosmopolitan perspective, this awareness of cultural diversity and its implications for claims about truth, this anticipates later developments in Greek thought. The sophists would use cultural relativism to argue that conventions were arbitrary. Plato would respond by seeking truths that transcended culture. Both were engaging with problems Xenophanes had identified. His life as a rhapsode shaped his philosophy. He performed for audiences, which meant he had to persuade them. You can't just assert controversial ideas to a crowd at a symposium. They'll dismiss you. You have to make your case compellingly, use memorable language, anticipate objections. That practical need for persuasion probably sharpened his arguments. The critique of anthropomorphism works partly because it's clever. Horses would paint horse gods. That's funny and thought-provoking simultaneously. It sticks in the mind. People remember it and think about it later. The epistemological claims have similar rhetorical power. Nobody's certain truth survives scrutiny. That line from Fragment B34 cuts deeper than most realize. It's not just philosophical modesty. It's a challenge to everyone who claims knowledge about things beyond direct observation. The gods exist somewhere humans can't reach. The nature of reality transcends individual experience. The ultimate causes of natural phenomena remain hidden behind appearances. How do you know anything about these matters with certainty? You don't. That's Xenophanes' answer, and it created problems for everyone who came after. Because here's what happens when you take that seriously. All religious claims become provisional. All metaphysical systems become hypothetical. All confident assertions about ultimate reality become questionable. The sophists picked up on this immediately. If nobody can know the truth about the gods, then religious practice becomes conventional rather than natural. If knowledge about ultimate reality is impossible, then practical success replaces philosophical truth as the goal. Plato hated this conclusion. His entire philosophical project aimed at refuting it. The forms exist precisely to provide objects of knowledge that transcend uncertain sensory experience. The philosopher king knows truth precisely because he's accessed reality beyond appearances. But Plato's response acknowledges Xenophanes' challenge. You can't just assert knowledge anymore. You have to explain how knowledge is possible, given the limitations of human experience. That question drives Greek philosophy for centuries. Aristotle develops empiricism to answer it. The Stoics develop theories of knowledge based on sense impressions. The skeptics embrace it and argue that suspension of judgment is the only rational response. Xenophanes didn't solve the problem, he identified it. and identifying the right problem is often more important than proposing solutions. The fragment B34 distinction between knowledge and opinion became standard in Greek philosophy. Knowledge requires certainty. Opinion might be true but lacks the guarantee of truth. This division shapes epistemology for the next 2,000 years. Medieval philosophers wrestling with faith and reason encountered the same problem. How do you know religious truths that can't be verified through experience? Revelation provides one answer. But how do you know revelation is genuine rather than delusion? Descartes starts modern philosophy by trying to find certainty in the midst of doubt. The cogito provides an anchor. I think therefore I am, but everything else requires proof, argument, justification. You can't just assume you know. This skeptical method traces back through medieval philosophy, through ancient skepticism, through Plato's dialogues, ultimately to Xenophanes' assertion that certain truth eludes human grasp. The scientific revolution responds to the same challenge differently. If direct knowledge of ultimate reality is impossible, then focus on what you can observe and measure. Build theories that predict and explain phenomena without claiming to reveal ultimate causes. Newton famously refused to hypothesize about what gravity ultimately is. He could describe how it works mathematically without knowing its essential nature. That methodological modesty echoes Xenophanes' epistemological caution. Modern science still operates on this principle. Theories are provisional. Evidence might overturn them. Certainty is impossible, but useful knowledge remains achievable through careful observation and testing. Xenophanes wouldn't recognize quantum mechanics or general relativity as responses to his challenge. But the epistemological humility behind modern science, the acknowledgement that human knowledge is limited and uncertain, that connects directly to his insight. The practical impact of this thinking is enormous. If religious certainty is impossible, then religious tolerance becomes easier to justify. You can't persecute heretics with complete confidence when you admit your own beliefs might be wrong. If political ideologies can't claim absolute truth, then compromise and experimentation become acceptable. You try things, see what works, adjust based on results, rather than defending theoretical purity. This isn't what Xenophanes intended. He was critiquing specific religious and philosophical claims in his own time. But ideas escape their original context and generate consequences their authors never imagined. The personal dimension adds another layer. Ancient testimony mentions that Xenophanes buried his sons with his own hands. Imagine that experience for someone who spent decades questioning certain knowledge and divine justice. Did his philosophy provide comfort or make the loss harder? When you've spent your life arguing that humans can't know divine purposes, does that help when tragedy strikes? Or does it remove even the cold comfort of believing suffering has meaning? We don't know. The fragments don't address personal grief. They maintain the philosophical stance, the critical distance, the refusal to claim certain knowledge about ultimate matters. That restraint is itself revealing. Philosophy for Xenophanes wasn't therapy or consolation. It was clear thinking about what humans can and cannot know. If that thinking provided no comfort during loss, he didn't compromise it to feel better. The relationship with Pythagoras adds complexity. Xenophanes attacked him, probably for claiming knowledge about reincarnation and the transmigration of souls. How do you know souls migrate between bodies? What evidence supports this? Pythagoras apparently claimed to remember previous lives. Xenophanes found this absurd, or at least unverifiable. The attack suggests his epistemological standards weren't merely theoretical. He applied them to specific claims by specific people. This makes him more than an abstract thinker. He was engaged in real intellectual combat with contemporaries, calling out what he saw as unjustified claims, demanding evidence and argument rather than assertion and authority. Heraclitus attacked Xenophanes in turn, though the details are unclear. The fragments suggest Heraclitus found Xenophanes' criticism excessive or misguided. But the fact of conflict indicates Xenophanes wasn't universally admired even among philosophers. That's worth noting. Modern accounts sometimes present pre-Socratic philosophy as a harmonious development where each thinker built on previous insights. The reality was messier. They argued, attacked each other, competed for students and recognition. Xenophanes participated in this competitive intellectual environment while making his living as a performer. That combination is unusual. Most philosophers either had wealthy patrons or taught for fees. Xenophanes composed poetry for symposia, performing his ideas alongside traditional hymns and drinking songs. The social criticism makes more sense in this context. At a symposium celebrating an athletic victory, Xenophanes would perform a poem arguing that wisdom matters more than physical prowess. Imagine the reception. Some audience members probably appreciated the challenge to conventional values. Others likely found it irritating or pretentious. But memorable either way. That's how ideas spread in oral culture. You make them striking enough that people remember and repeat them. The fragments on proper symposium behaviour reveal someone who understood the social dynamics of these gatherings. Drink in moderation, honour the gods appropriately, value wisdom and good conversation over displays of wealth. These aren't revolutionary moral insights, they're practical advice for maintaining civilized social interaction, but they reflect values consistent with his broader philosophy: moderation, piety, intellectual cultivation over material ostentation or physical achievement. The criticism of athletic values specifically targets a core element of Greek aristocratic culture. The Olympic Games and other competitions weren't just entertainment, they were how elite families displayed excellence, competed for prestige, maintained social hierarchies. Xenophanes challenged this directly. Your skill at running or wrestling doesn't make you valuable to the city. Wisdom does. Good governance does. This isn't just philosophical preference, it's social criticism aimed at existing power structures. Whether this won him friends or enemies probably varied by audience. Some cities valued intellectual culture and might have appreciated the argument. Others remained traditional and might have found it offensive. The fact that he kept performing these poems for 67 years suggests they found audiences. People kept inviting him to symposia, kept paying him to perform. The criticism was acceptable within certain contexts, even if not universally embraced. This tells us something about Greek society that's easy to miss. There was space for critical voices, at least in some places and times. Total conformity wasn't required. You could question traditional values and still function in society if you did it skillfully. Xenophanes' skill lay partly in his poetic craft. The fragments that survive show sophisticated use of metre and language. He wasn't just stating opinions, he was creating memorable verse that worked as both poetry and argument. The horse god's image is brilliant precisely because it's both funny and philosophically devastating. It makes people laugh while undermining their assumptions about deity. That combination is rare and valuable. The epistemological claims work similarly. The language is clear and quotable. The clear and certain truth no man has seen, nor will there be anyone who knows. That sticks in memory. You can repeat it in conversation. It becomes a reference point for subsequent discussion. This performative aspect of his philosophy matters. He wasn't writing treatises for scholars to analyse in libraries. He was speaking to live audiences who needed to understand and remember his points. The form shapes the content. Contrast this with Parmenides or Heraclitus, who wrote in deliberately difficult language that required study and interpretation. Their obscurity was intentional, creating mystery and demanding intellectual effort from readers. Xenophanes aimed for clarity. His arguments needed to work immediately because he was performing them. An audience at a symposium won't sit through lengthy, complex reasoning. You need to make your point efficiently and memorably. This doesn't make his philosophy superficial. It makes it adapted to its medium. The insights remain profound even when expressed in accessible language, maybe especially when expressed accessibly. Modern philosophy often values difficulty and technical vocabulary. The assumption is that complex ideas require complex expression, but Xenophanes demonstrates that fundamental philosophical insights can be stated clearly without losing depth. The theological critique works because it's simple. Humans imagine gods like themselves. Different cultures imagine different gods. Therefore, these images reflect human projection rather than divine reality. 3 steps clearly stated, devastating in implication. The epistemological point is equally straightforward. You can't verify claims about things beyond experience. Even if you happen to be right, you can't know you're right. Therefore, certainty is impossible. Simple but profound. These aren't arguments that require years of study to understand. Anyone paying attention can grasp them. That's part of their power. They're democratically accessible while remaining philosophically serious. This accessibility might explain why Xenophanes influenced so many later thinkers. You don't need specialized training to engage with his ideas. You just need to think about what he's saying and consider whether it's true. The fragments invite this engagement. They don't establish elaborate systems requiring acceptance of numerous premises. They make specific claims and offer specific arguments. You can agree or disagree with each one individually. This modularity makes Xenophanes' thought flexible. Later thinkers could accept his theological critique while rejecting his epistemology, or embrace his naturalistic explanations while dismissing his social criticism. The ideas don't form an inseparable package. Whether Xenophanes intended this flexibility or whether it emerged from the fragmentary survival of his work, the result is the same. His ideas became available for selective appropriation by subsequent philosophical traditions. The Eleatics took his theology and developed it into a metaphysics of unity and unchanging being. The skeptics took his epistemology and developed it into a comprehensive doubt about all knowledge claims. The natural philosophers took his explanations of phenomena and developed them into systematic investigations of nature. Each group found something useful in Xenophanes while ignoring other aspects of his thought. This is how influence works in intellectual history. Rarely does someone adopt another thinker's complete system. Usually they extract what serves their purposes and adapt it. Xenophanes enabled this process by keeping his ideas relatively independent of each other. The theological claims don't logically require the epistemological ones. The natural explanations don't depend on the social criticism. You can accept some without accepting all. This makes him a resource rather than a school founder. People drew on his work without becoming Xenophanians. They used his insights to develop their own positions without feeling obligated to defend everything he said. That's a different kind of influence than building a movement or establishing a tradition. It's more diffuse but potentially more pervasive. His ideas became part of the intellectual toolkit available to Greek philosophers without requiring adherence to a specific doctrine. The question of what Xenophanes himself would have thought about these later developments is unanswerable. We don't know how he understood the relationship between his various claims. We don't know which he considered central and which peripheral. What we know is that his ideas proved useful to multiple subsequent traditions in different ways. That suggests they addressed genuine problems and offered resources for thinking about those problems. The resources he offered weren't systematic theories, but pointed observations that exposed assumptions others hadn't questioned. When someone argues gods must be like humans because that's how everyone depicts them, Xenophanes shows the circularity. When someone claims certain knowledge about divine nature, he demonstrates why such certainty is impossible. These interventions don't build philosophical systems, they clear ground. Think of him as creating openings rather than filling them. The opening to question traditional theology, the opening to demand evidence for natural phenomena, the opening to recognize the limits of human knowledge. Later philosophers walked through these openings in different directions, but Xenophanes created the space for that movement. This brings us back to the fundamental question about his legacy. Was he a philosopher or a poet? The question itself reveals assumptions about how philosophy should operate. If philosophy requires systematic theory building, rigorous argumentation, and comprehensive answers to fundamental questions, then Xenophanes falls short. His fragments don't constitute a system. His arguments aren't always rigorous by later standards. His answers raise more questions than they resolve. But if philosophy can also mean critical examination of received ideas, willingness to question authority, and insistence on rational standards for belief, then Xenophanes absolutely qualifies. He did all of those things consistently across his surviving work. The poetic form doesn't disqualify philosophical content any more than Plato's dialogues cease being philosophy because they're dramatic works. The real issue isn't the medium, but the method. Xenophanes applied critical reason to traditional beliefs and found them wanting. He proposed alternative explanations based on observation and inference. He articulated standards for knowledge that later thinkers would develop into epistemology. That's philosophical work regardless of the literary form it takes. His influence on subsequent philosophy operated through these critical interventions rather than through doctrinal transmission. You can trace the impact not by finding people who accepted his complete worldview, because there weren't any, but by finding people who responded to his challenges. Plato's critique of traditional theology in the Republic echoes Xenophanes. Aristotle's careful distinctions between knowledge and opinion build on foundations Xenophanes laid. The ancient skeptics found in his epistemology ammunition for their position. Each of these responses adapted Xenophanes to different purposes. None simply repeated what he said. They took his insights and developed them in directions he probably never imagined. That's how philosophical influence typically works. Ideas get picked up, transformed, integrated into new contexts. The original formulation becomes a starting point for further thought rather than a final destination. What makes Xenophanes particularly interesting is how his ideas remained productive across such different philosophical projects. Theological critique served both those who wanted to reform religion and those who wanted to abandon it. Epistemological humility supported both moderate fallibilism and radical skepticism. Natural explanations enabled both materialist reductions and sophisticated accounts of causation. The same fragments generated multiple philosophical trajectories. So what do we do with a man who lived 25 centuries ago, whose work survives in pieces, whose life remains mostly unknown, but whose questions never stopped mattering? We acknowledge what's lost. The full arguments, the complete poems, the personal voice behind the fragments, the context that would resolve our interpretive disputes. Most of what Xenophanes wrote is gone, and with it, the full picture of how he understood his own project. But we also recognize what remains. The critique of anthropomorphism that made theology a matter for rational discussion rather than poetic tradition. The epistemological insight that certainty about ultimate matters exceeds human capacity. The naturalistic explanations that separated physical phenomena from divine intervention. The social criticism that questioned whether Greek culture valued what actually mattered. These weren't minor observations. They were fundamental shifts in how people thought about religion, knowledge, nature, and society. One wandering poet performing at symposia across the Greek world for 67 years created openings that later thinkers would spend centuries exploring. The fragments we have are enough to see why those openings mattered. They exposed assumptions others hadn't questioned. They applied critical reason to areas previously governed by tradition and authority. They demonstrated that asking how you know what you claim to know isn't pedantic skepticism, but necessary intellectual hygiene. Xenophanes didn't build philosophical systems. He cleared ground. He showed that the traditional answers were inadequate, that the conventional wisdom rested on unexamined assumptions, that certainty was harder to achieve than people believed. That's not less valuable than system building. It's the necessary precondition for it. Every philosopher who came after him had to respond to the problems he identified. They couldn't just assert knowledge about divine nature after Xenophanes asked how humans could verify such claims. They couldn't just accept anthropomorphic gods after he showed the projection involved. They couldn't just invoke divine causation after he demonstrated natural explanations worked for observable phenomena. The responses varied wildly. Some embraced his skepticism, others tried to overcome it. Some developed his theological insights, others rejected them, but none could ignore them. That's influence, not agreement but engagement, not discipleship but ongoing dialogue with questions that won't disappear. And somewhere in all of this there was a person, an exile who left Colophon at 25 and never found another home, someone who buried sons and kept travelling, who performed for symposia and criticised the values being celebrated, who observed fossils on mountains and wondered what they meant, who looked at traditional religion and saw human psychology rather than divine revelation. We'll never know him fully. The fragments don't reveal that much personality. The ancient testimony is sparse and unreliable. What we have are the ideas preserved because they proved useful to people with agendas Xenophanes never anticipated. But the ideas keep working. They keep generating new questions and enabling new insights. They remain relevant not because Xenophanes was prophetic, but because he identified genuine problems in how humans think about knowledge, divinity, and nature. Those problems don't have final solutions. Each generation approaches them differently based on available evidence and current concerns. But the questions persist. How do we know what we claim to know? What can we legitimately infer about things beyond direct observation? When should we accept traditional beliefs, and when should we question them? Xenophanes asked those questions 25 centuries ago. We're still working on the answers,